Today we're jumping into the fifth week on our series on creating new habits, missional habits that draw out of us the gift and opportunity to make real impact in our world, to challenge us to become followers of Christ who live lives that are questionable enough that people around us start asking, why do you do that? Why in the midst of all the chaos and pain that you too are going through, how do you have hope? How do you have life in the midst of all of this COVID stuff? How do you have joy when you know that your family's struggling, right? To create some new ways of thinking and seeing. So our first habit was to bless 3 people, one of whom isn't in our church, for an entire week. Second one was to eat with 3 people, one of whom doesn't go to our church. Last week, we talked about listening. I was like, what am I missing? I wasn't listening to myself. Last week, we talked about taking 20 minutes, a 20-minute block somewhere in your week to specifically set it aside and listen to what the Spirit of God is saying to you. And each week as we started this, I've given you just a few minutes to turn to a neighbor and talk with them about how you experienced last week. Last week was hard. I know. For many people, it's like, I've never spent 20 minutes just listening to the Spirit. So here's what I'd like you to do. If it was hard for you, it's okay. You can just name it. It was hard for me. But still, talk about one of the 3 experiences that you've had over the last 3 weeks, about one of those habits, and share with your neighbor how it's made an impact in you. Ready, go. Come back together. This is my favorite, right? Like, I love getting you talking to each other, and then right when you get right in the middle of your sentence, cutting you off. It's a great way to go. Now, you may be thinking that it's crazy that we do this kind of just starting moment of the message part of our series by having you talk to each other. But what I'm hoping, right, is that it models for us what we're called to do. That part of being the church means that we're in relationship and that we're living these practices together, right? We don't do this in isolation. And so just for a moment, even in the experience of worship, what worship should be on a Sunday is equipping and preparing us to go out and do the same thing in our week. And so that's the point of having us chat together. So today's habit is the habit of learning Christ. Now, this might sound like an odd phrase, but actually it comes from the early church. The expression to learn Christ was a common phrase in early Christianity. In fact, if you go back to some of the early kind of catechetical texts, they're all built around learning who Christ is. How many of you did either CCD or confirmation in your childhood? Look around you, right? What that is catechesis, right? The whole point of CCD, or which is the Catholic kind of version that you experience if you're a Catholic, or confirmation in our Lutheran ideology, is this idea that we're putting on the things to learn Christ. So it meant in the early church entering into a period of catechism, committing oneself to intensely studying the person and the work of Jesus. Now, how many of you stopped really learning after Don't raise your hand, I'm just kidding. But as a pastor, right, that's been one of the experiences that I've had of adults in church, is we did confirmation. Our parents checked the box. You're in. You get to go to heaven now, right? Even though that isn't our theology, but you're safe. You've accepted your own faith. And then we accepted our own faith, and many of us said, all right, great, done. Right? It's like our college degree that we hang on our wall and like we never have to read another book. And you laugh, but I know lots of people who the last book they read was when they were in college. So we still have this need as people of faith, whether we've gone through any form of catechesis or not, to unlearn and to relearn who Jesus is and what Jesus is doing in the world. We would do well to habitually study the Gospels for ourselves each day. When I was growing up, it was very fashionable, if you were a Christian, to wear a little bracelet that said WWJD. Anybody have one of those? Yeah. You still wearing yours, Tom? Okay. He raised his hand back there. I just had to check. It said WWJD, and it just means, what would Jesus do? In fact, at that time in the 90s, it was, for those of you who don't know, the 90s was not that long ago. But for our kids, they weren't even born yet. In the 90s, there was this push back to what would Jesus do. It was on shirts and bracelets and bumper stickers, and it was on banners in front of our churches. And that phrase comes from a great little book by Charles Sheldon called In His Steps. And in that book, if you haven't read it, go home, read it. It's literally a one-day quick read. This novel is about a church where the pastor challenges their people to think about, at each moment of their life, what would Jesus do in this moment? What would Jesus be calling you to do at your work and in your school and in your senior retirement home and in your hospital and in your neighborhood? At each moment where you encounter somebody else, to start framing the question of what would Jesus do? See, I think that if we're being sent into the world to live questionable lives, to arouse curiosity in our world, to answer people's inquiries of how we have the hope that we have within us, then we need more than ever now to understand how Jesus would interact, what Jesus might be calling us to do in any given circumstance. And we can't know that if we're not submerging ourselves in who Jesus is, what Jesus did, what he had to say, and how he interacted in the world. So, C.S. Lewis said it this way: in the same way the church exists for nothing else than to draw humanity into Christ, to make us little Christs, if they're not doing that, all the cathedrals, clergy, missions, sermons, even the Bible itself are simply a waste of time. God became man for no other purpose. It's even doubtful, whether the whole universe was created for any other purpose. It says in the Bible that the whole universe was made for Christ and that everything is to be gathered in him. So for Lewis, this call to be forming ourselves and each other into little Christ is this call that we're to be preoccupied with who Jesus is and how Jesus lives in our world. And I might say, Rustin, I know who Jesus is. I don't need to read about it. I don't need to spend any time studying that. I remember when I was in college, I had spent the previous 12 years before college reading my Bible every day. I was Baptist. That was a very normal thing that you did as a Baptist. Had a little devotional, read my Bible, did a little journaling for 12 years every day prior to going to college. And the Jesus that I knew from that looked a lot like me. Anybody's Jesus look a lot like them? Looked a lot like me. He was white. He was Baptist. He read the Bible the way I read it. All of this. And then I go to college, and I start seeing the world with some different eyes. Now, I've been given these habits, and I've put on these habits of reading my Bible and journaling and doing devotional, and so I kept doing that while I was in college. It wasn't like I just abandoned that, but I kept doing that, and as I was reading and going to class and studying who Jesus was, I started reading about that Jesus was a Jew. Who would have thought? Right? I read my Bible my entire life, and all of a sudden, I go to college, and now Jesus is a Jew. And he's not white, but he's Middle Eastern. And so I start seeing things a little differently. And I come back to those gospel texts that I had read over and over and over. And this time, as I'm reading them, because I'm studying the culture and the context and the climate around what's happening in this time, both politically and emotionally and mentally and physically in the lives of people in the time of Jesus. And I come to Luke and I start seeing how Jesus is like caring for women. And he's touching lepers who touching them means you're unclean. And he's healing women in the street who have been bleeding for years. And he's reaching out to the least of these. And I started realizing that the Jesus that I knew in my childhood was beautiful. He looked like me. He was wonderful and loving. My Jesus wasn't vengeful and violent. He was loving and kind and compassionate. But this new, relearned reality of Jesus who is encountering the least of these starts awakening me to the social justice realities around me in my school and in my neighborhood and in my world. And I start asking different questions. And I start understanding new things. Then fast forward, I start working in my first church after graduating college, and in that space, I meet again a different understanding of Jesus in the midst of these gospels, and I start seeing new things, and fast forward to grad school, and I'm studying, and at each of these moments, this commitment to studying Jesus, right? Learning the patterns of Christ, it happens over and over. I learn new things all the time about who Jesus is and how Jesus interacts. I was speaking with Mary this morning on my way into church, and Mary said, I'm reading Revelation, but I'm reading Revelation through the lens that it's about Jesus, and it changes everything. Heck yeah. Right? It's not just about the end of the world as we know it, but it's about this victorious Christ coming and liberating all of us. So this pattern of studying Christ doesn't stop when we're 12. If it does, I guarantee you your Jesus looks a lot like you did when you were 12. And you may be wondering why the church and your faith no longer work for you. And it's because you're not 12. So we have to start digging deep again and saying, God, as a 42-year-old human or a 62-year-old human or a 80-year-old human, show me who Jesus is anew. Awaken me to who Christ is and what Christ might be calling me to do here and now in my very neighborhood and world. See, this pattern of faith is a pattern of unlearning and relearning over and over and over again. So let me suggest a few things that you can do with your time as you learn Christ. The first is very simple. Read the Gospels. Read them over and over and over again. In fact, if you've never done it before, sit down in one setting and read a gospel through. If you don't like to read, there's a great thing called Audible. If you haven't heard of it yet, it'll read to you, and it's amazing. In fact, you can listen to the Gospel of Mark in 90 minutes, or the Gospel of John in 2 hours, or you can get through Matthew and Luke in about 2.5 hours. And if you're like me and you like to listen at 1.5 speed, you can get there much quicker, because all those readers read too slow. Or you can just sit down with a text and read it, or set up a side of a daily devotional for you where you're just picking a set of the text, one chapter a day, and just read the Gospels again. Pick one and just walk through it. Begin to ask Jesus to reveal Jesus' self to you in this new day, in your new time. Many of you practice a process called Lectio Divina, or divine reading. In fact, we have Lectio Divina groups in this church, where you read the text, and the first time through, as you're reading it aloud, you pick a phrase that attracts you or connects with you and write it down. Then read it again and ask a question like, where does this reading touch my life today? Then read it a third time, right? Because frequently what we do is we come to the text and we check our box. Anybody else a box checker in here? Love checking boxes. I create extra boxes just so I can check them every day. But this isn't about checking a box. This is about falling in love with Jesus again and again and again. My wife and I yesterday were celebrating our anniversary of our engagement. It's a beautiful time, and it's always the week before Valentine's, so I don't have to worry about Valentine's. Check the box, right? Check the box. Thanks, Mike. But what I love about celebrating that anniversary is it reminds me why I'm in love with Heather today. Because the Heather that was 16 years ago is very different. And the Rustin that was 16 years ago, God forbid, is very different. And so you have to choose to fall in love again and again, and we do the same thing with Christ. So you can read the Gospels, but a second thing that I challenge you to do is don't just read the Gospels, but read books about Jesus. There's so much great work out there. Scholars and people who have spent so much time studying and putting context into what's happening, and even great novels about Jesus. Read them. Get to meet Jesus in a new way, because sometimes when you've been reading the Bible as long as I have every day of your life, if I'm super honest, sometimes I get bored with it. And so I need something to, and you're like, the pastor gets bored with the Bible? Take a deep breath, you're fine. So I reach into other things that are awakening me to who this Jesus might be. And you know what I love to do most? And I didn't used to love this, but I had to learn to love this. I read what people have to say about Jesus who are different than me. So I read what women scholars and devotional writers have to say about who Jesus is. I read what people of color have to say about who Jesus is. I read about people who have a different ideology than me have to say about Jesus is, because in each of those readings, I experience a new reality of understanding who Christ is. I'm going to post a list for you, if you want it, on my Instagram and Facebook feed and on the church website of a list of books about Jesus that you can read. There's a great one coming out again this week. It's one of my favorite old books. It's called Read Jesus. It's by Mike Frost and Alan Hirsch, and it's just being re-released at the end of this month. And it's all about that the church needs to jump back in to remembering who Jesus is. Then finally, read the Gospels, read books about Jesus. But I know there's some of you out there who hate to read. Can I get an amen? Some of you talk to me all the time about, I don't love to read. You know what? For the first time in our life, you have more podcasts and more movies and more videos about Jesus than you could possibly fill your month with, coming out every week. So explore, go on your favorite podcast platform. If you don't know what a podcast is, come talk to me after. And just put in Jesus and see what pops up and listen to a few of them. Anybody seen The Chosen? It's a great new video or show that's come out about the life of Jesus and his disciples, and it's beautiful. It's beautifully shot, and the characters come to life in new ways. Watch things like Godspell and Jesus of Montreal, or even things that might challenge you about who Jesus is. But whatever you do, right, this week, this is your challenge. Spend at least 20 minutes this week learning Jesus. 20 minutes, set aside, block it in your calendar to learn anew who Jesus is. And then take that as you go in your week and say, what would this Jesus I met anew do today? Please pray with me. God, we love comfort. But sometimes comfort gets in the way of connecting with you. So challenge us. Awaken us to new ideas of who you are. Reawaken us to things of you that we forgot. Help us unlearn and drop off some old ideologies about you that we've held on to for a long time. For the mere purpose that we fall in love with you again. And how we connect to not only do you love us, but we love you. We pray this in your holy name.